why is the most resource-rich continent on Earth, a place that literally holds the origins of humanity, still trapped in this cycle of extreme poverty?
It is a massive question, yeah.
Right, because for decades now, it just seemed like the longer these nations were independent, the poorer they actually became. And usually, when we look at historical economics, we want a clear X-ray. We want to point to a jagged white line on the film and say, oh, there is the fracture. That is exactly what went wrong.
Right, but people rarely do that with Africa.
Exactly.
Yeah.
The traditional diagnoses we get are just incredibly murky. You hear the same usual suspects all the time in casual conversation or even, in serious policy debates.
Oh, yeah, people always point to harsh geography or tropical diseases.
Yeah, or they fall back on these deeply problematic narratives about ancient tribal hatreds that just, supposedly cannot be resolved.
And those traditional narratives are just so pervasive because they offer this really convenient off-ramp. I mean, if a society's struggles are framed as just the inevitable result of its geography or some inherent cultural trait, it shifts the focus entirely away from historical interventions.
Right. It lets the outside world off the hook.
Exactly. It creates this closed loop of logic where the current state of affairs is treated as just a natural baseline rather than the result of very specific engineered disruptions.
Well, today for this deep dive, we are looking at a diagnostic tool that attempts to completely shatter that closed loop. We have a piece of source material that is just fascinating.
It really is.
It's a 2012 National Bureau of Economic Research working paper, and it's titled Colonialism and Economic Development in Africa. It was authored by Leander Heldring, who is an economics PhD from Oxford, and James A. Robinson, a government professor from Harvard.
And Robinson actually co-authored the book Why Nations Fail, so he is a major voice in this field.
Yeah, top-tier scholars. And the mission of this deep dive today is to basically reconstruct the brutal logic of how the world actually works. We want to strip away the dense academic jargon and really look at the relentless historical data they present.
Because what makes this paper so compelling isn't just its conclusion. It is how it uses these massive data sets to challenge almost everything we assume about global economic development.
Right. The authors build this meticulous argument that African development was not aided, but actively and uniformly derailed by colonialism. And they do it in a way that is going to cause a lot of face-slapping wait-what moments for you as you listen.
Oh, for sure. The paper is this rigorous exercise in historical reconstruction. Because Heldring and Robinson are addressing a very old, very entrenched academic debate here.
Yeah, and let's start with what they call the Great Consensus Illusion, which is just wild to think about.
It is. Because for a long time, there was this surprisingly broad consensus across completely different political spectrums regarding the colonial impact on Africa. I mean, the authors point out that you had conservative European colonial administrators on one side and then radical Marxist theorists on the exact opposite side.
Yeah.
And they were looking at the same map and coming to a very similar conclusion, which was that colonization, despite all its obvious violence, was basically a net positive for the continent's long-term economic trajectory.
Which sounds crazy today, but you have to look at their reasoning. The British administrators, they framed it as this grand civilizing mission, right? They thought they were bringing commerce and railroads and modern administration to what they literally called a dark continent.
Yeah, that was the conservative justification.
But then the Marxists, on the other hand, they viewed imperialism as this brutal but totally necessary historical mechanism. They thought it was required to drag pre-capitalist societies into the global capitalist system.
Right, because in Marxist theory, going through capitalism is a mandatory step before you can ever reach a socialist utopia.
Exactly. So both sides basically looked at the introduction of the railway and the export market and decided, well, progress is being made, however painful it is.
But the authors argue that this consensus is built on a massive methodological flaw. I mean, you cannot evaluate the impact of an historical intervention just by looking at the changes that happened during that intervention. You have to compare those changes against a baseline.
Right. And this introduces a concept that I really want to nail down for everyone listening, the counterfactual.
Yeah, the counterfactual is standard in modern economic analysis, but it is incredibly difficult to apply to history. Basically, they ask you to consider what would have happened to these societies if the colonizers had just never arrived.
And I want to spend a second on this because, honestly, it feels a bit like trying to measure a shadow. I mean, how do you measure something that never actually happened?
It is tricky.
Like, if we are trying to understand the impact of a car crash on a pedestrian, we don't just look at the victim lying in a hospital bed and say, well, his broken leg is slowly healing, and the hospital gave him a nice lunch, so the car crash actually improved his situation.
Right, that would be absurd.
Obviously. You have to look at the fact that 10 minutes prior, he was walking perfectly fine and he was on his way to work. You measure the damage by the momentum that was lost. But how do economists quantify lost historical momentum without just, writing speculative science fiction?
Well, they do it by tracking real trajectories and using comparative global data. The researchers look at the institutional and technological momentum that African societies possessed right before the scramble for Africa in the late 19th century.
The 1885 Berlin Conference, basically.
That's exactly. And they also look at the developmental arcs of nations in other parts of the world that actually managed to keep their sovereignty during the age of imperialism, places like Japan or Thailand or Iran.
Oh, that makes sense.
Yeah, by looking at how those uncolonized nations absorbed global technologies and modernized autonomously, the authors can build a very plausible baseline for what African autonomous development might have looked like.
Okay, so to apply this method accurately, the paper says we can't just treat Africa as one giant blur. It is a massive continent. So they divide it into three distinct categories based on the political realities of 1885.
Right, the three different crime scenes, essentially.
Yeah, crime scenes is a good way to put it. The first category is pre-colonial centralized states. So think of places like Botswana, Ghana, and Rwanda. The second is white settler colonies, places like South Africa, Zimbabwe, and Kenya, where Europeans actually moved in permanently.
And the third category encompasses the uncentralized or mixed regions, like Nigeria or Sierra Leone.
So why is that categorization so important?
Because the colonial mechanism of extraction had to adapt to whatever the local environment was. Let's look at that first group, the centralized states, and what was actually happening in 1885. Because the defenders of colonialism always lean heavily on a very specific snapshot of Africa at that moment.
The idea that they were just fundamentally backward.
Right. And if you look at the historical data, like the work by Jack Goody and Robin Law that the paper cites, sub-Saharan Africa outside of Ethiopia was indeed technologically lagging. I mean, they lacked the wheel. They weren't using the plow for agriculture.
And obviously the transatlantic and trans-Saharan slave trades had just severely distorted their demographics and their economies for centuries. I mean, in West Africa alone, estimates suggest slaves made up between a third and half of the entire population.
Yeah, it was devastating. So the European powers pointed to that snapshot, the lack of tech and the huge amount of slavery, as their moral and economic justification for invading. They had, look, we are the necessary catalyst for modernization.
Right, but here is the huge counterintuitive bomb that Heldring and Robinson drop. They argue that being technologically behind in 1885 absolutely does not justify colonization.
Not at all.
Because the paper presents hard evidence that these African societies were actively engaged in their own process of institutional modernization. They were fixing it themselves.
Yes. The historical evidence about pre-colonial state formation is incredible. Look at the Buganda Kingdom in modern-day Uganda, or the Asante Empire in modern-day Ghana. During the 19th century, right before the Europeans took over, these states were not stagnant at all. They were undergoing very aggressive political centralization.
And state centralization is one of those terms that sounds super dry and academic, but it is literally the foundation of everything we consider modern civilization.
Exactly. It means instead of having 50 different warlords or local clan chiefs constantly fighting over resources, a single central authority steps up and monopolizes power.
They build a unified bureaucracy, they standardize the laws.
And crucially, they build the capacity to provide public goods. You cannot build a national highway system or a legal code if your territory is chopped up among independent tribal leaders.
Right, Europe went through this exact same brutal phase of state building centuries earlier.
Yeah, and the Asante kings were doing it too. They were systematically stripping hereditary power away from local clan heads. They were replacing them with a meritocratic bureaucracy that was loyal to the central state. They were building complex road networks to boost internal trade.
I read in the paper they even referenced the Kuba state in Central Africa, which independently developed a system of trial by a jury of one's peers.
Yes, It was a highly sophisticated, autonomous evolution of political institutions.
So they were doing it. It's like, imagine watching a kid learning to build this really complex Lego castle. They are figuring out structural integrity and load-bearing walls, and then some guy walks into the room, completely smashes the castle to pieces, uses the rubble to build a super basic brick wall, and then turns to the kid and says, "You're welcome, I just gave you architecture."
That is exactly what happened. The disruption was absolute.
Yeah.
Because when the British engaged the Asante state, they did not let that natural centralization continue. They hit the pause button forever.
How did they stop it?
They used a system called indirect rule because the British wanted to keep their administrative costs as low as possible.
Oh.
So instead of running things themselves, they actually sought out the very local chiefs and tribal leaders that the Asante kings had been trying to marginalize.
Oh, wow. So they deliberately reversed the progress.
Yes, they propped those local figures back up, gave them colonial power, and completely shattered the process of national integration. They refragmented the political landscape just to make it easier to control.
That is wild. And that mechanism of indirect rule really makes you reconsider the physical stuff the colonizers built, because the traditional narrative always points to the railroads. People say, well, sure, the politics were messy, but they brought advanced engineering and they connected the continent to the global economy.
Yeah. But Heldring and Robinson completely dismantled that infrastructure argument. You just have to look at the geographical layout of those colonial railway networks to see their true purpose.
Right.
If you look at railways in the U.S. or Western Europe in the 19th century, they look like spider webs. They connect agricultural hubs to cities, they facilitate internal trade, they build a domestic market.
But the maps of colonial African railways look nothing like that. They are literally just straight lines drawn from an inland mine or a cash crop plantation straight out to the coastal ports.
Exactly. They were not built to connect African communities to each other.
Yeah.
The paper cites researchers who point out that these railways often actively bypassed local population centers entirely.
So they didn't build a highway system for a society. They basically built a conveyor belt for a robbery.
That is a perfect way to put it. It was an extraction utility. The colonial states actually had to use violent coercion to force the local population to maintain these railways because the tracks offered zero economic benefit to indigenous trade. It was just a pipe to move wealth out of the continent.
Which perfectly transitions us into the second category of colonies the paper analyzes. And this one is perhaps the most devastating: the white settler colonies.
Yes, places like South Africa, Kenya, and Zimbabwe.
Because while the infrastructure was extracting resources in places like Ghana, the dynamic in the settler colonies involved a much deeper level of economic rewiring. And this is where we have to tackle the big lie of the so-called technical dividend.
The technical dividend is the idea that European technology and modern farming fundamentally boosted the overall GDP of the region.
Right. And technically, if you look at the macroeconomic data, the paper acknowledges that per capita GDP in many of these colonies did show a slow upward trend between 1885 and 1960.
Yeah, the defenders of colonialism lean on that growth curve heavily. They say, look, mining and commercial farming expanded the pie.
But the authors ask the most important question: who was actually eating that pie? A rising GDP did not translate to rising living standards for the actual indigenous people living there. In fact, they experienced an apocalyptic drop in their quality of life.
And that drop happened primarily through the systematic, violent confiscation of the means of production. In an agrarian society, the means of production is land.
Right. And the prime example they use is South Africa, specifically the Native Land Act of 1913. This is just a masterclass in how colonial institutions legally engineered poverty.
It really is. The 1913 Land Act legally allocated 93% of the country's land to the tiny white minority. And the massive black African majority was shoved onto designated reserves that made up only 7% of the land.
93% of the land to a tiny minority.
Yes. And it wasn't just any land. The 93% included all the most fertile agricultural regions and the richest mineral deposits. The 7% given to the indigenous population was almost entirely arid, barren, economically useless land.
The sheer scale of that theft is just hard to wrap your head around. It is an instant erasure of a whole population's economic autonomy. And the authors of this paper don't just state this as a sad historical fact. They actually use a modern macroeconomic model to prove exactly how much devastation this caused to the black majority's living standards.
Yeah, they used the Cobb-Douglas production function.
Okay, I want us to really visualize the data here. Can you break down the math of this model? Because seeing the numbers makes the brutal reality so much clearer. How does this model prove a drop in welfare?
Sure. So the Cobb-Douglas model is a foundational tool in economics. It calculates the relationship between inputs, which in an agrarian economy is mostly land and labor, and the total output of that economy. The authors use this to set up a baseline of welfare before and after the 1913 land grab.
Okay, so imagine a normal competitive market.
Right. In a normal agrarian economy, a worker's wage is based on their marginal productivity. If you have a farmer working a huge 100-acre plot of great land, their labor yields a high output.
Any sense?
But if you pass a law that suddenly forces that exact same farmer and all their neighbors onto a tiny 7-acre plot of terrible soil, the ratio of labor to land completely skyrockets. You have way too many people trying to extract a living from way too little land.
So the marginal productivity of their labor just completely collapses.
Exactly. Now, for the math part, the paper plugs the variables of that 1913 land distribution into the Cobb-Douglas equation. They take the labor share of income, which they set as a standard coefficient called alpha, usually about 2/3.
Okay.
And when they calculate the ratio of the new wages compared to the old wages, they basically take that tiny 7% land share and raise it to the power of 1 minus alpha.
And what is the result?
The result is staggering. The mathematical output predicts that this single act of restricting the land caused an immediate, devastating 59% plunge in the real living standards of the indigenous population.
A 60% drop in welfare, practically overnight, just from the sheer math of artificial land scarcity.
Yes. And the craziest part, the authors stress that this 59% drop is actually a conservative estimate.
Wait, conservative? How could it be worse?
Because the Cobb-Douglas model assumes a free, competitive labor market. It assumes that even though the workers lost their land, they could still freely sell their labor to the highest bidder on the open market.
Oh, right. But the colonial market wasn't free at all.
Exactly. The settler state actively suppressed wages. They set up what economists call a monopsony, basically a market where there is only one buyer for labor. In South Africa, the Chamber of Mines acted as a massive cartel. They completely eliminated competition between mining companies, and they colluded to fix wages for black laborers at artificially incredibly low levels.
And the data on this wage suppression is just mind-blowing. The paper cites a really famous 1972 study by an economist named Francis Wilson. He dug into the actual company records of the South African gold mining industry.
Yeah, he tracked the wages starting in 1911, right before the Land Act, all the way to 1969.
A nearly 60-year period. And this was an era of a massive, unprecedented boom in the global demand for gold.
Right. The mines got way more technologically efficient, total output exploded, revenue exploded, the macroeconomic GDP was soaring.
But Wilson's data shows that over that exact same 60-year period, the real inflation-adjusted wages of a black African gold miner actually decreased by 20%.
Decreased by a fifth.
It is unbelievable. They literally dug out the most valuable rocks on Earth for 6 decades during a massive economic boom, and they got poorer doing it.
It's because the system was engineered so perfectly that the workers were entirely insulated from the economic value they were creating. The government used things like the color bar, which legally banned black workers from advancing into any skilled, higher-paying jobs. Those were reserved exclusively for white settlers.
So they created this deeply entrenched dual economy.
Yes, all the wealth from the extraction and the cheap labor went straight to a tiny, tiny elite.
You can really see the societal impact of this when the authors look at the Gini coefficient.
Oh, yeah.
For those listening, the Gini coefficient is how economists measure wealth inequality. A score of 0 means perfect equality. A score of 1 means absolute inequality, where literally one person owns everything.
And the paper notes that in colonial Kenya, which was another settler economy that stole massive amounts of land for white-owned farms, the Gini coefficient spiked to an astronomical 0.70 by 1950.
0.70 is just staggering. That level of inequality is a ticking time bomb. It practically guarantees structural tearing of the society. The wealth was intentionally hoarded to subsidize the high living standards of a minute fraction of people.
Right. But this is where the paper addresses a really bizarre paradox, because defenders of colonialism will point to another set of data to argue that European rule was actually benevolent.
Yeah, this is the part that really messes with your head. Because while Africans were losing their land and their wages were plunging, Historical biometric data shows that their average height and life expectancy actually increased slightly.
Right, military recruit data from places like Kenya and Ghana showed heights went up by about 3 to 5 centimeters.
So if you just look at surface level metrics, you see taller bodies and longer lives, and you think, oh, European medicine and sanitation policies were actively helping these people. Was this European charity?
Absolutely not. And the authors deliver a really harsh, face-slapping truth here. They dove into the historical archives, the internal memos of the colonial health ministries, and the motivation behind these public health initiatives had nothing to do with humanitarianism.
Not at all.
The white colonial officials were absolutely terrified of infectious diseases, malaria, sleeping sickness, cholera. And the documents show they explicitly viewed the indigenous population not as human patients, but as a biological reservoir of pathogens that could infect the white settlements.
Wow. So they were vaccinating and treating people purely out of self-protection.
Entirely. It was self-serving public health. The government in Zimbabwe actually wrote down that treating diseases in the native population was a required step for maintaining a quote-unquote healthy white nation.
They needed a labor force healthy enough to survive the mines, and they needed a sanitary buffer zone. So you're saying they essentially treated the local population the way a factory owner oils a machine.
That is exactly it.
Like, he doesn't oil the gears because he has empathy for the metal. He does it so the machine doesn't break down and start a fire that burns down his factory.
Perfectly said. The increase in height and life expectancy was just a byproduct of industrial maintenance. It wasn't an investment in human capital. It was protecting the factory owners from sparks.
And speaking of treating human beings like machines, let's talk about the colonizers' absolute proudest boast, the abolition of slavery.
Oh, the hypocrisy here is just incredible.
The Europeans constantly patted themselves on the back for ending the transatlantic slave trade and stopping indigenous slavery in Africa. They acted like they were the ultimate champions of human rights.
Right. But Heldring and Robinson used comparative global timelines to completely dismantle that myth. Because in the late 19th and early 20th centuries, the whole world was moving away from forced labor.
And the paper points out that uncolonized sovereign nations adapted to this new global standard on their own. Thailand officially abolished slavery in 1915. Iran abolished it in 1928.
But then look at the territories controlled by the British Empire, the power that bragged the most about abolition. The colonial administration in Sierra Leone didn't officially abolish slavery until 1928. In Ghana, it was 1930.
And in Nigeria, it wasn't officially dismantled until 1936. So the sovereign, uncolonized nations abolished it way before the supposedly enlightened colonizers did.
Because the delay was completely intentional. The colonial economies ran on cheap, compliant labor. They postponed abolition for as long as they could get away with it politically.
And when they finally did ban it on paper, did things actually change?
No, they basically just changed the paperwork. As soon as they banned slavery, they immediately instituted mass forced labor quotas.
Because they needed people to build those straight line railways and the roads.
Exactly. They used a system of corvée labor. They legally compelled individuals to work on state projects for practically zero pay, and if you refused, you faced violence or prison.
Imagine the dark irony of that for the listener. Imagine being told you are finally legally free, only to immediately be handed a shovel and marched to a railway line under the threat of a gun by the exact same government that supposedly just freed you.
The monopoly on violence just shifted from private slaveholders to the colonial bureaucracy. It was rebranded slavery.
So let's fast forward past the mid-20th century, the era of decolonization. The colonizers finally pack up their flags and leave. So why, by the year 2000, were countries like Burundi, the Democratic Republic of Congo, Rwanda, Sierra Leone, and Zimbabwe actually poorer than the day they gained independence?
The post-independence economic crash is a grim reality. From the 60s through the 90s, much of sub-Saharan Africa saw a huge economic contraction. And critics often weaponize this. They say, see, this proves African nations couldn't govern themselves without European administrators.
But the paper argues that this completely misunderstands what those new African leaders actually inherited, because the Europeans did not leave behind a functional modern state.
No, they left behind a highly tuned extraction machine. They left an authoritarian bureaucracy that had spent 80 years doing one specific thing: suppressing the public, blocking political participation, and funneling wealth to a tiny ruling elite.
So when the newly independent leaders took over, leaders who had been actively excluded from democratic institution building their whole lives, they just took the keys to this despotic, unaccountable machine and kept driving it.
Exactly. The political instability of the post-colonial era is a direct continuation of the colonial legacy. The state was already programmed for plunder. The only thing that changed was the identity of the elites pulling the levers.
But there is an ultimate counterexample to this, a case study that basically proves the paper's entire thesis, and that is Botswana.
Botswana is the great African economic miracle. Since independence in 1966, they have had some of the highest sustained economic growth rates in the world. They have a stable democracy. They managed their diamond wealth to actually benefit their people. They completely avoided the resource curse.
Now, the traditional defense of colonialism might say, well, Botswana succeeded because the British were just really good administrators there. Maybe they built great schools.
But the historical truth is the exact opposite. The British barely invested anything in the Bechuanaland Protectorate, which became Botswana. The real reason Botswana succeeded, as the authors show, is that the local indigenous leadership fiercely resisted British indirect rule.
Right, the Swana elites.
Yes, they already had pre-colonial political institutions with real accountability. They had public assemblies called the Kgutla, where chiefs actually had to listen to the grievances of the community. They had a social contract.
So when the British tried to force their standard indirect rule, which would have meant turning those chiefs into autocrats and destroying the assemblies, the Tswana leaders fought back diplomatically and politically.
And they won. They deflected the colonial administration and protected their traditional democratic institutions.
Wait, so the best example of a successful former colony is the one that managed to basically ignore the colonizers?
Exactly. Because they held the colonial machine at bay, they arrived at independence with their social fabric and their accountability mechanisms intact. Their wealth today is a direct result of deflecting colonial influence.
Which totally validates the counterfactual we talked about at the start. If the rest of Africa had been left alone to evolve their institutions like Botswana did, they would likely be far, far better off today.
The data strongly suggests that, yes.
And the tragedy of these disrupted societies gets even darker when you look at how colonial policies actively engineered violent conflict. I mean, we've talked about the extraction and the poverty, but the paper also goes deep into how the colonizers fundamentally rewired the social identities of the people they ruled.
And the most chilling example of this is the 1994 Rwandan genocide,
Where 800,000 people were slaughtered in just 100 days. It is almost always written off in the media as this ancient tribal hatred, just an inevitable eruption of primordial violence between the Hutu and the Tutsi.
But the historical analysis completely shatters that myth. Before the German and Belgian colonizers arrived, the categories of Hutu and Tutsi were not rigid, blood-feud ethnic enemies. The pre-colonial society was hierarchical, sure, but the distinction was mostly economic. It was based on how many cattle you owned.
There's a fluid class system.
Very fluid. If a Hutu person accumulated enough wealth, enough cattle, they could rise in status and essentially become Tutsi. People intermarried, they shared a language, they shared a culture.
And then the Belgians show up.
Right. And to rule a dense population cheaply, the Belgians needed local enforcers. So they looked at the existing class structure and decided to co-opt the wealthier Tutsi minority as their proxies. But to make that system permanent, they had to eliminate the fluidity. They needed rigid categories.
So in 1932, the Belgian colonizers introduced a piece of bureaucracy that lit the fuse for the entire genocide.
Mandatory identity cards.
They surveyed everyone, counted their cattle, literally measured their physical features with pseudo-scientific racist metrics, and permanently branded everyone as either Hutu or Tutsi on an official ID card.
They took a fluid economic class and legally weaponized it into a rigid, racialized caste system. If your card said Hutu, you and your kids were Hutu forever. If it said Tutsi, you were Tutsi forever.
And then they gave all the power, the education, the colonial patronage exclusively to the Tutsi minority while actively crushing the Hutu majority.
They forced people to carry a piece of paper that explicitly labeled them as either the oppressor or the oppressed. They used the Tutsi to extract taxes and enforce forced labor on the Hutu.
Okay.
It engineered a deep structural hatred that just did not exist in that form before.
It is terrifying. A bureaucratic tool designed for administrative convenience in 1932 directly catalyzed an ocean of blood 60 years later. When the Belgians finally left, they handed over a society that they had legally turned into a pressure cooker.
The hatred wasn't ancient. It was a modern political construct.
And the authors point out this engineering of conflict happened everywhere under indirect rule.
Yeah, look at places like Sierra Leone or Nigeria. The British drew completely arbitrary borders. They forced historically rival groups into a single administrative unit and then appointed paramount chiefs who had zero historical legitimacy.
They just tied enemies together in a political death knot, destroyed any traditional social contracts, and then basically said, all right, good luck running a peaceful democracy.
It's a recipe for perpetual civil war. Because when the state is built purely as a machine for extracting wealth, capturing the government becomes a matter of absolute survival. That is what drives the endless cycles of coups we see.
So let's look at the final verdict here. We started with the myth that colonialism civilized Africa and brought modern development. But when you synthesize all the data Heldring and Robinson present, the exact opposite is true.
The evidence is overwhelming. Colonization violently interrupted autonomous state centralization. It used forced labor and massive land grabs to engineer profound inequality, dropping living standards by nearly 60% in some areas. It delayed the end of slavery, and it purposely fractured social cohesion, leaving behind despotic state structures.
They brought a temporary artificial peace and some straight-line railways, but they took the gold and they left a highly centralized, racist, uncheckable machine of plunder.
Compared to the plausible counterfactual of autonomous evolution, colonialism uniformly derailed the continent.
But we have to remember, history never truly goes away. And this brings us to a final, really provocative thought for you listening, because colonialism locked Africa into the absolute bottom of the international division of labor.
And you can see that dynamic playing out right now.
Exactly. Look at the headlines today. There is an intense, massive global scramble happening right now for Africa's resources. The cobalt in the DRC, the lithium, the rare earth minerals that are absolutely critical for our smartphones, electric vehicles, and the entire green energy transition.
Multinational corporations are negotiating for these resources right now, operating in those exact same institutional environments that were historically engineered for extraction.
The actors have changed and the minerals have changed, but the structural dynamics are eerily similar. So as you look at modern globalization, ask yourself, are we really looking at a new world of equitable free trade? Or are we just watching the brutal logic of 1885 wearing a brand new suit? The mechanisms might be more sophisticated, but the underlying equation of who profits and who pays the cost demands our scrutiny. Keep that historical momentum in mind the next time you plug in your phone. Thank you for joining us on this deep dive. See you next time.